Okay, so we have learned how to find slope from a graph, and today we're going to learn how to find slope from a table. Okay, so let's look first at a graph. Let's review what we know. We know that the slope of a line is a vertical change, or the ratio of the vertical change over the horizontal change. So we've talked about that. The vertical change over the horizontal change is the slope. And then we introduced the ratio delta y over delta x. Delta means change, so this is change in y over change in x. Now, here's a graph. This is something that we know how to find the slope of. So I see a point here and a point here. I'm going to draw my slope triangle. That's a bad slope triangle, okay? And I'm going to count my vertical change. My vertical change is 3. My horizontal change is 1. That simplifies to 3, right? So the slope of this line is 3. Now, notice I have 3 points. Let me change colors so it doesn't match with that line there. I have 3 points picked on this line. That point, and that point, right? Those points have coordinates. Every point on this line has coordinates, but I'm going to pick these 3 points and I'm going to put them in this table. So this point has coordinates -1, -3. So I'm going to put -1 in the x column and -3 in the y column. That's the coordinates of that point, right? This point, that's the origin, right? What are the coordinates of the origin? 0, 0, right? And then this point has coordinates. I go over 1 and up 3. So that point has coordinates 1, 3. Okay? Now, if I have a table, here's how I find slope from a table. I need the change in y over the change in x. Well, here's my y's, right? So what I want to know is how does it get from -3 to 0? Well, look up here. If you need the number line to help you, you may not. But from -3 to 0, I'm going in the positive direction, right? So I'm doing plus, and I'm going 1, 2, 3 spaces. So from -3 to 0, I add 3 spaces, right? I go in the positive direction, 3 spaces. From 0 to 3, how many spaces is it from 0 to 3? 1, 2, 3. So I add 3 to get from 0 to 3. So my change in y is 3, right? A positive 3. Now, what about my change in x? How do I get from -1 to 0? Well, from -1 to 0 is 1 space, right? And in the positive direction, so I add 1. How do I get from 0 to 1? I add 1. So my change in x is positive 1. So I have a positive 3 over a positive 1, and 3 over 1 is 3. Look, I get the same slope. Whether I do it from the graph or from the table, it's the same. All right, now let's look at this line. So I have several points here. Remember, I can choose any 2 of them. I would suggest you choose 2 close together, but remember, it doesn't matter. You will simplify if it's a bigger number. So I'm going to draw this slope triangle. Okay, my vertical change right here is 1, 2. So my vertical change is 2. My horizontal change is 1, 2, 3. So 2/3, and this line has negative slope, right? It's going down from left to right. So the slope of that line is -2/3. Now, let's take the points from this line that we have. We've got a point here and here and here, and let's put it in the table. So this point has coordinates -3, 2, right? So I'm going to put -3, 2. That's the ordered pair for that point. I've got the origin again. That's this one here. It has coordinates 0, 0. And this point is 1, 2, 3 in the positive direction and 2 down. So it is 3, -2, right? Okay, so let's find the change in y over the change in x. So y is over here. How does y change? Well, how do I get from 2 to 0? From 2 to 0, I go in the negative direction, right? I'm going down when I go from 2 to 0, and I go 1, 2 spaces. So 2 to 0 is -2. And how do I go from 0 to -2? Well, I go in the negative direction, so I'm going down 1, 2. So that is also negative 2. How do I get from negative 3 to 0? Well, negative 3 to 0, here's negative 3, here's 0. I'm going in the positive direction. 1, 2, 3 spaces. So I add 3. How do I get from 0 to 3? Well, 0 to 3, I go 1, 2, 3, right? I add 3 to get from 0 to 3. So my change in y, that's over here on the right, is negative 2. My change in x is positive 3. So I get negative 2 thirds. And look at that. The slope was the same, which we would expect, right? So we can find it from a graph. We can find it from a table. Okay, so we don't have to graph the points every time. We can just do from the table. So remember, we want the change in y over the change in x. So look at the change in y here. How do I get from 0 to 4? Well, to get from 0 to 4, I add 4, right? You could check that here. From 0 to 4, I go in the positive direction and I go 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces, right? How do I get from 4 to 8? Well, from 4 to 8, I go 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces, so I add 4. So my change in y is a positive 4. What about my change in x? How do I get from a negative 6 to a negative 4? Well, here's negative 6, here's negative 4. That's in a positive direction, right? I'm getting bigger, and I go 1, 2 spaces. So I add 2 to get from negative 6 to negative 4. How do I get from negative 4 to negative 2? I'm going in the positive direction, that's to the right, and I go 1, 2. So I add 2. So a positive 4 over a positive 2, that simplifies. 4 over 2 is 2. Okay, now you won't always have a number line because sometimes the numbers are big, but you can handle it. You can also use a calculator sometimes. Just be careful with your signs. So look at this one. I have 50, 20, 60, 15, 70, 10. This would be one I definitely wouldn't want to graph, right? These are big numbers. So how do I get from 20 to 15? Well, from 20 to 15, I go down. And I can do this on a calculator. 20 minus 15 is 5. So I go down 5. How do I go from 15 to 10? I'm going down, right? And 15 to 10, I'm subtracting 5. Okay, so my change in y, that's always on the right, my change in y is negative 5. My change in x, how do I get from 50 to 60? That's easy, right? I add 10. How do I get from 60 to 70? I add 10. So my change in x is a positive 10. Now think about your division rules. When you're dividing a negative by a positive, your answer is negative, and 5/10, you can put that in your calculator. 5/10 simplifies to 1/2. So a negative 5 over a positive 10 is negative 1/2. Okay, one more. All right, so let's see our change in y. Change in y is always on the right. How do I get from 20 to 12? I'm going down, right? And if I do 20 minus 12 in my calculator, if I need to, I'm going down 8, okay? Because that's not on my number line. How do I get from 12 to 4? I'm going down, and 12 minus 4 is 8. So I went down 8. So my change in y is negative 8. How do I go from 0 to negative 2? Well, from 0 to negative 2, I'm going down. That's a negative, right? And how many spaces? 1, 2 spaces. So I'm going down 2. From negative 2 to negative 4, here's negative 2. Negative 4 is to the left, so I'm going down. How many spaces? 1, 2. So my change in x is always on the left, is negative 2. Now, what happens when I have a negative over a negative? A negative divided by a negative is a positive, and negative 8 over negative 2 is a positive 4. Okay, so there are 3 examples of finding slope from a table. Look at the signs. Make sure you pay attention to what happens to your signs. Okay, you have a Google form in Google Classroom that you can now complete that will give you some practice with both slope from a graph and slope from a table. Good luck!